This happened last autumn, sometime in the first week or two of October. Honestly, I'm not even sure how to introduce this, because none of it felt planned or expected. It started like any other ordinary Monday. I finished work and pulled into my driveway just as the sun was going down. Normally, I'd pull straight into the garage and head inside without thinking twice. But that day, something caught my eye on the front door. Instead of parking in the garage, I left the car in the driveway and walked up to see what it was. There was an envelope taped directly to the door handle. I could immediately tell it wasn't junk mail or some advertisement because my name was written on it by hand. When I opened it, I found a handwritten note inside. The message itself wasn't long, but it was unsettling. The person wrote that they'd been interested in me and wanted to meet up at a certain place and time the very next day. What stood out to me was that the day they picked happened to be my day off from work. I told myself that part was probably just a coincidence. What made it worse was the fact that the letter wasn't signed at all. I had no clue who wrote it. There was no way I was going to meet some unknown person, so I went inside, ripped the letter into pieces, and threw it away. The whole thing bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Whoever wrote it knew my name and exactly where I lived, and casually said they were interested in me, something that felt deeply wrong coming from a complete stranger. I tried to convince myself that destroying the letter would help me forget about it, since there wasn't really anything I could do, at least not yet. I kept telling myself it might have just been a dumb prank. Eventually, I went about the rest of my night and got into bed a little before 11. Since I had the next day off, I slept in and stayed home pretty much the entire day. I honestly don't remember doing much at all. I know I made dinner late, around 8 or 9, and then started getting ready for bed. I went upstairs to my bedroom and decided to take a long shower to relax. Partway through the shower, I heard the doorbell ring. I froze, confused about who would be at my house that late. I pulled back the shower curtain slightly and listened, but after a moment of silence, I assumed whoever it was had left. I wasn't planning on answering the door anyway, so I closed the curtain and let the water keep running. As I stood there, trying to calm down, my mind drifted back to the note from the day before, and the timing of the doorbell suddenly didn't feel random anymore. I knew I could be reading too much into it, but the longer I stood there, the stronger the feeling grew that something wasn't right. Then I heard it. Soft, dull sounds, like light bumps or quiet creaks, coming from just outside the shower curtain. My body locked up. I listened for another second, then quickly shut off the water and yanked the curtain open. There was nothing there. Still shaking, I stepped out, dried myself off, and got dressed as fast as I could. The first thing on my mind was the front door. I slowly went downstairs and peered through the peephole. No one was there. After a moment, I opened the door. A small piece of paper immediately slipped out and fell to the floor. Before picking it up, I scanned the street. The only sounds were wind moving through the trees and insects in the distance. The neighborhood was completely still and dark. I picked up the paper, shut the door, and unfolded it. It was another note, written in the exact same handwriting as the first one. As I read it, my stomach dropped. The person sounded angry, clearly upset that I hadn't shown up to the meeting earlier that day. It was written as if they fully expected me to be there. This time, they signed it with initials, DN. That's when it really sank in. This wasn't just some harmless message anymore. It felt targeted, personal, and far more disturbing than a simple prank. I had no idea what to do. Whoever left it was already gone, and even with the initials, I had no clue who they were. I spent at least 30 minutes pacing around my living room, trying to think. Even inside my own house, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I kept checking the windows and the doors over and over, but I never saw anything out of place. Eventually, I realized there was nothing else I could do. I'd have to try to sleep. I eventually made up my mind that first thing in the morning, I'd go straight to the police station with the note and see what they thought. With that plan in my head, I started walking upstairs toward my bedroom. Halfway up, I stopped cold. I heard it again, the same dull thumping or faint creaking noises I'd noticed earlier in the shower. This time they were coming from inside my bedroom. I rushed in, heart pounding, and scanned the room. Nothing was out of place. There was absolutely no explanation for the sounds I'd just heard. To be fair, the noises themselves weren't loud or alarming. Under normal circumstances, I probably wouldn't have thought twice about them. But after everything that had happened, my nerves were shot, and every little sound felt loaded with meaning. Even so, I tried to calm myself down. I shut my bedroom door, locked it, and checked the closet and every corner of the room, just to ease my mind. As I was about to climb into bed, another thought hit me. There was one more place I hadn't checked. Attached to my bedroom was a small balcony. I almost never used it, and since I valued my privacy, I always kept the blinds closed. Most of the time, I honestly forgot it was even there. I walked over and pushed the blinds aside enough to reach the door. I didn't even need to touch the handle to realize something was wrong. The door was unlocked. I knew for a fact I hadn't left it that way. Before I could even react, movement caught my eye. A figure stepped out from the corner of the balcony. I locked eyes with him for a split second as he stared straight at me and moved closer to the glass. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I spun around and bolted out of the bedroom. Behind me, I heard the balcony door slide open. I ran as fast as I could to the nearest neighbor I trusted, knowing they'd help. The man either lost track of me or couldn't tell which direction I'd gone. The police arrived at my house within 10 minutes and immediately started searching the area. Even with officers there, I couldn't calm down. The thought of him getting away was terrifying, and unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. They never found him. As I talked through the timeline with a couple of the officers, everything started to make horrifying sense. He must have broken into my home while I was in the shower. The sounds I'd heard earlier were likely him opening and closing the balcony door as he slipped in and hid. And when I heard those same noises again later, that meant he'd gone back inside the house while I was downstairs, pacing and reading the note. That explains why the feeling of being watched had been so strong, because I actually was. What unsettles me the most, though, is the brief glimpse I got of his face. There was something familiar about him, not someone I knew personally, but someone I might have seen before, maybe in passing, maybe somewhere completely ordinary. That's what keeps bothering me, the idea that a random, forgettable encounter, something as simple as crossing paths in a grocery store, could have been enough for him to fixate on me and start stalking me is deeply disturbing. That night could have ended so much worse, and I'm painfully aware of how lucky I was to escape with my life. It's been almost a year now, and nothing else has happened. No notes, no strange noises, no signs of him. I want to believe it's over, but even now I still catch myself glancing behind me, wondering if someone is watching, just out of sight. I was in the middle of a cross-country drive, heading from Los Angeles back to the East Coast. I'd gone out for a wedding and planned to see a few friends, but what was supposed to be a short visit turned into more than a week. Because of that, I was now on a tight deadline, only 4 days to make it home before my next work shift. That meant long stretches of non-stop driving with almost no room for mistakes. By the time this happened, it was already 1 a.m. and I was barely holding it together. My eyes burned, like my eyelids were made of lead and wanted to slam shut every few seconds. The only caffeine I'd had was a cup of gas station coffee from about 3 hours earlier, which was long past doing anything useful. On top of that, I was driving through absolute nowhere. The highway felt abandoned. Nothing but darkness on both sides, no buildings, no lights, just endless road. There were hardly any vehicles around either. Every once in a while a car would rush past me, only to vanish into the darkness half a minute later. As I struggled to stay focused, I noticed headlights coming up behind me again. They weren't bright at all, which stood out immediately. No blinding LEDs, no modern glare, just dull, weak headlights, like they belonged to an older car. Whoever it was also wasn't speeding like the others. They were crawling toward me, taking way longer than normal to catch up. After sitting behind me for about a minute, the car moved into the next lane to pass. I stayed locked on the road, keeping steady and making sure I didn't drift. But something felt off. They weren't actually pulling ahead. After a few seconds of this, I finally glanced to my left. The car was right next to me, perfectly matching my speed. It was an old, dusty, dark red vehicle, and the driver's window was rolled down. There was only one person inside, a man behind the wheel, and he was staring straight at me. My window was still up, and with it being dark and full of reflections, I wasn't even sure he could see me clearly. But the way he was looking at my window made it feel like he could. He wasn't subtle about it either. The inside light of his car was on, lighting up his face completely. I could see him clearly. His eyes were red, his movements sloppy, and just from the way he carried himself, he looked drunk, or at least not right. Still, he kept pace with me, refusing to speed up or fall back, just watching. My stomach dropped. I tried slowing down slightly, hoping he'd keep going. He slowed down too. I eased off even more. Same thing, he matched me again. Finally, I slammed the brakes enough to drop down to around 25 miles per hour, ridiculously slow for a highway. That's when it worked. He didn't follow this time. He stayed at his speed and continued forward, eventually disappearing into the darkness ahead. I had no idea what to make of it. Maybe he was just a creep. Maybe he was drunk. Honestly, it could have been both. A few minutes later, exhaustion came crashing back over me. I was fighting sleep again, worse than before. I knew I needed more caffeine, and probably a short break before I did something stupid. About 15 minutes down the road, I spotted a small rest stop and pulled off the highway. It looked bare bones, a couple of bathrooms and a single coffee machine. No other cars in sight. I parked, got out, and went straight for the machine, grabbing another coffee and hoping it would be enough to keep me alive. As I walked back toward my car, headlights rolled into the lot. My heart sank immediately. It was the same old red car. I froze. There was no way this made sense. I hadn't passed him, at least not that I remembered, and there were no exits or places for him to stop without me noticing. The only way he could have ended up behind me again was if he pulled way off the highway and waited, hidden, until I drove past. I got into my car and checked my mirrors, trying to stay calm. He didn't park behind me. Instead, he pulled up right next to me, exactly like he had on the highway. And even without looking, I could feel his eyes on me, burning into the side of my car, impossible to ignore. I finally looked over, and there it was. He was staring straight at me, eyes bloodshot and wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. I couldn't understand what this guy wanted. I turned my key to start the car, but before I could pull away, he began shouting, trying to get my attention through the closed window. When I glanced back again, he leaned over and swung his passenger door open, waving at me to come over. He was smiling, almost cheerful, and that somehow made it even more disturbing. I hit the gas. As I started to drive off, I looked over one last time and saw his expression drop instantly. No smile, no emotion, just a cold, empty stare. I merged back onto the highway and he followed me. He tried the same move as before, pulling into the next lane and pacing me side by side. This time, though, I wasn't staying calm. I sped up, slowed down, changed my rhythm. Anything to keep distance. He did the same, matching every move. At one point, It felt like he was deliberately swerving toward my car, like he was trying to clip my rear end. A couple of times, I barely managed to brake in time to avoid contact. Then I spotted one of those emergency turnaround gaps in the highway, the kind meant for police and ambulances to cross into the opposite lanes. Without thinking about how illegal or dangerous it was, I made a split-second decision. I cut across and flipped directions before he had time to react. As I sped away on the other side of the highway, I checked my mirrors, heart hammering in my chest. For a brief moment, his brake lights flared, like he was considering following me. Then they dimmed, shrinking into the distance as he kept going the other way. I didn't stop shaking for a while. I drove until I found a gas station, parked, and sat there for almost an hour, just trying to calm down and put as much space as possible between me and that car. While I was there, I called in a tip to the police, mostly reporting what I assumed was a drunk driver behaving dangerously. Nothing really came of it, and eventually, life moved on. That was until 4 days later, after I'd finally made it home. With some distance from the whole thing, and time to breathe, I decided to look up whether the police had arrested any drunk drivers on that stretch of road. I half expected to see a mugshot, or at least some kind of update. What I found was far worse. The day before I left Los Angeles, someone had gone missing on that exact highway. Their vehicle had been discovered abandoned in the grass off the road. The person themselves was never found. The only lead investigators had came from another driver, who reported seeing a rusty red car driving aggressively around the missing person's vehicle shortly before it was abandoned. Reading through the details sent chills through me. It was like reliving my own experience step by step, except that person never made it out. If I hadn't reacted when I did, if I'd hesitated even for a second longer, that night could have ended very differently, and I might have vanished too. Last winter, I rented a cabin tucked away in the northeastern mountains of Washington state and stayed there for a full week. It was one of those cabins built specifically for winter use, insulated, sturdy, and meant for enjoying snow-covered scenery that most standard seasonal cabins can't handle. When I first arrived, there wasn't any snow on the ground yet, but by the time I woke up the next morning, everything had changed. Snow was coming down hard, blanketing the area so thoroughly that going anywhere wasn't really an option. I spent the entire day inside, enjoying the warmth of the fireplace and the cozy, isolated atmosphere. It was calm, quiet, and honestly perfect. By around 9 that night, I was exhausted and ready for bed. That's when I realized I'd left one of my bags in the car the night before. I threw on my jacket and boots, opened the front door, and stepped onto the porch, only to stop immediately. The snow out there didn't look right. Parts of it were disturbed, like someone had been standing on the porch. As I stepped closer, it became obvious. Footprints, clear boot prints pressed into the snow. I followed them with my eyes, trying to see where they led. They disappeared off the porch and stretched toward the tree line, eventually fading into the woods. I had no idea how long they'd been there, and what bothered me most was that I never heard anyone approach the cabin. Whoever it was hadn't knocked or announced themselves. Still, I grabbed my bag from the car and went back inside. Since no one tried to contact me, and I hadn't gotten any messages from the rental company, I convinced myself it was probably nothing serious. That night I went to bed and slept. Over the next 2 days, not much changed. I stayed inside most of the time, sitting by the fire and enjoying the isolation. But every now and then, I'd glance outside, and each time, I noticed the same thing. Fresh footprints. They always appeared in the same spot, leading up to the porch and then turning back toward the woods. Same size, same pattern, same direction. By the 3rd day, curiosity got the better of me. I bundled up in a thick coat and stepped into the forest, heading in the direction the prints usually went. Overnight snowfall had buried any old tracks, so I was relying entirely on memory. I didn't get far before everything started looking identical: trees, snow, and silence in every direction. It was disorienting. With fresh snow already beginning to erase my own footprints, I realized pushing deeper would be a bad idea. I turned around and headed back. From what I'd seen, there was nothing out there. No trail, no road, nothing that explained why anyone would be walking up to my cabin. After that, something strange happened. For the rest of the day, no new footprints appeared. I told myself maybe whoever it was realized I was paying attention and decided to stay away. At least, that's what I hoped. As evening settled in, the sun dipped behind the trees and the forest grew still. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the fire popping in the fireplace and the soft hiss of snow falling outside. I hadn't thought about the footprints in hours. I stayed up late, not crawling into bed until around midnight. Sleep came fast, wrapped in the quiet rhythm of winter. I must have been out for a while, deep enough to lose track of time, because when I woke up, it felt like hours had passed. I guessed it was around 3 in the morning. The wind and snowfall were still brushing against the cabin walls. But this time, there was something else. Every few seconds I heard it, a faint crunch, slow, careful. Someone walking through the snow at an almost unnatural pace. Honestly, if I hadn't already known there were footprints outside the cabin, I'm not even sure I would have recognized the sound as footsteps at all. I probably wouldn't have woken up. That's how slow and deliberate it was. I sat up in bed. Strangely, I felt calm, not relaxed, definitely nervous, but not outright terrified either. I remember thinking that if something happened, I could handle myself. Looking back, that confidence was incredibly stupid and maybe even dangerous. I stayed perfectly still, listening. After a while, the sound stopped. It seemed like whoever it was had moved toward the opposite end of the cabin, maybe near the back wall where the fireplace was. After several minutes of complete silence, I finally got out of bed and stepped into the hallway, staring down its length. It was completely dark. There weren't any lights installed in that hallway, so all I could see was pitch black nothingness. And in that exact moment, the false confidence I'd had seconds earlier completely vanished. A sudden, overpowering sense of dread took over. This didn't feel like someone casually walking around outside anymore. Something was seriously wrong. I took a few careful steps into the hallway, listening as hard as I could. Still nothing. I kept moving until I reached the far end, where the living room and kitchen were. Just as I took a step toward the front door, a loud, heavy thump hit the floor behind me. I spun around instantly, staring back down the hallway I'd just walked through. I only caught a split-second glimpse, someone moving fast through the shadows, charging straight down the hallway toward me. I didn't think, I just ran. I sprinted for the front door, grabbed the keys I'd left sitting right next to it, and burst outside, barefoot, straight into the snow. I jumped into my car, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest, but I couldn't see anything. The windshield was completely covered in a thick layer of snow. I had no idea if he was right behind me, chasing me, or standing directly in front of the car. Not knowing made it even more terrifying. The only thing I could see through was the rear windshield. It was small and narrow, but clear enough. I threw the car into reverse and backed down the gravel driveway as fast as I dared. Somehow, I made it out. It took more than an hour for the police to arrive. By the time they showed up, fresh snowfall had already covered the footprints he'd left behind, making it impossible to tell which direction he went. From what we were able to figure out, the man had entered through a window on the far side of the cabin, close to the fireplace. Based on the layout and the timing, it's likely he then quietly moved down the hallway to the farthest bedroom, the only other one besides mine, thinking that's where I was. If he had picked the right room, I would have come face to face with him, with nowhere to run and no time to react. Instead, I stepped out of my room at exactly the right moment. It's horrifying to think about, but just a few seconds, barely any time at all, were the only thing that kept that night from ending in a completely different way.